Welcome to the second episode of We Only Want the Earth. And I'm going to take on a pretty hard question in this one, and that's to look at the violence and political movements. What do people mean when they talk about violence and non-violence? How do we measure these things? And what I'm going to use to talk about it is the way Extinction Rebellion has talked about it. Because at the moment, that's obviously a big and growing movement that's having a lot of influence, but there's some really weird stuff going on in terms of the way they frame the debate. And I'm going to argue that that's not coincidental. In fact, it's been framed that way because they actually don't want to have a discussion around what was called diversity of tactics back in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the period that gave us the summit protest movement. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, if you look up their website, you'll often find this reference to how research has proved that non-violent movements succeed 53% of the time, whereas violent movements only succeed 23% of the time. Now, I saw this in several different documents, mentioned several different times, and as it often happens in these cases where I see something cited but I don't see a reference to where it's from, I begin to wonder, what is this research? And the funny thing is, you find this a lot. You then follow that sort of suspicion down, and you find that, in fact, a research paper is being misused to say something it never really said in the original. Now, you tend to associate that methodology with climate change deniers, so typical climate change denier tactic is you find that there's a glacier that has grown bigger instead of smaller, and you kind of build a whole thing out of this glacier that's got a bit bigger and ignore the fact that all the other glaciers are getting smaller. You don't really expect that from our side of it, but I'm going to show that in this question of violence versus non-violence, that's exactly what has been done. That's probably why the paper is never referenced. And in fact, when you dig into the paper itself, it starts to get quite weird, and you start to think about what is the purpose of this, why is it being framed in this way, and indeed, what are the affiliations of the people behind producing it. So this story is going to go all the way down, and it's going to end up pretty much with the CIA. I'm not saying it's the CIA, but it's pretty much the CIA. We're going to find that out. Okay, so let's start with the specifics. What is it that Extinction Rebellion say? And if you go and have a look at the FAQ, you'll find this section on why do you think non-violence is important. And what it says is, according to research on conflicts between non-state and state actors around the world between 1900 and 2006, it was found that 53% of non-violent campaigns were successful, as opposed to 26% of campaigns that choose violence. Moreover, of the violent campaigns, 95% had descended into dictatorship or totalitarian rule within 5 years. Now, there's some clues straight away that this research isn't talking about something that's vaguely analogous to the environmental movement. It's talking about something else. But we're going to park that to one side. I'm going to come back to that in a while. And I'm just going to focus in on this 26% success rate for violence campaigns versus 53% success rate for non-violent campaigns. Big numbers. Sounds like a big difference. Surely that settles the argument. Not really, because as we're going to see, first of all, what is meant by these terms. What is violence? What is non-violence? And then secondly, how applicable are these numbers to the environmental movement and debates about tactics within that movement? So the first question is, according to research, well, what research? And the answer to that is this research paper, which is a paper called Why Civil Resistance Works: The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict by Maria J. Stephan and Erica Chenoweth. We're going to return to who those people are towards the end. Well, at least who Maria is, because that turns out to be quite interesting and quite important. So this Why Civil Resistance Works paper, that turns out to be the key thing. And the first thing I became aware of was that, I think it was Peter Gentzelus, was saying that paper was drawing on this database that defined violence as conflicts in which there were over 1,000 deaths of combatants. Okay, so competence is an important word there. It doesn't just mean a conflict in which over 1,000 people get killed, but a conflict in which over 1,000 soldiers or volunteers or whatever your terminology might be get killed. That's pretty big conflict. In fact, if you think about it, that conflict at a size that would exclude movements like, say, the Zapatistas in southern Mexico that had a rebellion in 1994, and in fact would even exclude the Red Army faction in West Germany in the 1970s and 80s. You know, I mean, people would definitely call the RAF a violence movement. And Zapatistas, I mean, they did stage an armed insurrection, so they could certainly be termed violent. So it seems a little strange that under this definition, both of those movements are being defined as non-violent. And secondly, we might look for the definition of a non-violent group. Now, frustratingly, that isn't actually in the paper. Non-violent groups are defined as those who are primarily non-violent. What does primarily non-violence mean? How much violence is allowed and what sort of violence, and how are you defining violence before a group becomes defined as violent? That's not actually, we're not told that. What we are told is that they basically reviewed the literature, they drew up a list of what they considered to be non-violent campaigns based on that literature, and then they submitted that to other researchers in non-violence for confirmation and for the suggestion of additional groups. There's a couple of things that are really obvious in that. One is these are two entirely different data sets drawn up by entirely different groups of people. At least one of the data sets, this kind of violent conflict data set, has got a very clear mark in it that defines when groups get put into it, and that's when there are over 1,000 deaths of combatants. But the other data set is quite mysterious. The researchers drew it up, they showed it to some other researchers, those people thought it was okay, or they added stuff, and then that's the thing that they produce, this 53% success rate and 26% success rate from. Immediately you've got to sort of wonder about that. The actual original research paper then goes on to acknowledge that violent and non-violent tactics often coexist. I mean, that makes complete sense. You know, the real world, most movements in the real world, almost any significant struggle you can think of is not defined by just one group involved in that struggle. If you were to pick the 1950s, 1960s in America and the struggles against racism, well, I mean, that goes all the way from non-violent direct action groups like the civil rights movement, through to armed defense groups like Deacons for Defense, through to the Black Panthers. And some people would consider those later groups more violent than the earlier groups. Arguably, that's fair enough. If you think about the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, you've the same sort of thing. In fact, there's no real world struggles that you can simply go, well, that was completely non-violent or that was completely violent. And as is going to be important, and I'm going to talk about how this worked out in Ireland, it's very often the case that a movement starts in one place and then ends up in another, because it's state repression that actually often determines whether a movement is violent or non-violent. So the next issue with the Why Civil Resistance Works paper is that it's premised on what's most effective in reaching a compromise. It says, one of the disadvantages it presents as of violence is that potentially sympathetic publics perceive maximalist or extremist goals beyond accommodation as being typical of violent campaigns, where non-violent resistance groups were seen as less extreme and more accommodating. It's sort of an attitude that makes sense, but when we're talking about the need to halt climate change within 11 years, basically to overturn our existing economy and bring in a new post-capitalist economy, you're not really talking about something that there are compromises on. That we need to keep warming below 2 degrees centigrade. We have big problems at 2 degrees centigrade. Ideally, we'd like to keep it below 1.5 degrees. The trajectory we're on at the moment is not going to do that. And we can't really compromise on, okay, 4 degrees is fine in 2030, or 6 degrees is just grand, it won't be a problem. These things would be problems. So how much space is there in terms of compromise? Indeed, should we be starting off on the premise that actually what we need to do here is compromise? We'll ask for a 2 degree increase, they'll offer an 8-degree increase and we'll split the difference and end up at 6. That doesn't really seem to be a good strategy. So these are the flaws in the Why Civil Resistance Works paper, and I think these flaws on their own kind of mean that you can't really use it for a discussion around radical tactics in the environmental movement. It's worth reading. I think there is useful concepts in it, and there are things that get you thinking about what violence is, what non-violence is, and how it applies to protest movements. But it can't be used in the way Extinction Rebellion are using it. So at this point, it probably becomes a little bit useful to talk about what my opinions are on this. I'm not an ideological pacifist, you've probably already gathered that. But in fact, the Why Civil Resistance Works movement paper actually explicitly says that, in fact, most participants in non-violent struggles are not ideological pacifists. There are people who recognise them as non-violence as a tactically sensible thing to use in a particular context. And I'm very open to that. I think that makes lots of sense. I think, an active worship of violence as a political method is pretty disastrous. I think that's much more associated with the far right than anything else. I'm much more into mass movements, but I do think such movements need to defend themselves, and I do think at times they need to go beyond that. And I'm going to talk about that and my experience of that sort of in the next couple of segments. I think tactical insurrection makes sense in some contexts. No problem saying that whatsoever. I was a supporter of the Zapatista uprising in southern Mexico in 1994. That was a proper armed uprising, sort of secretively organised. They took over 4 major towns, scattered across quite a major territory. There was a fairly sustained conflict with the army. There were maybe 200 to 300 people killed in that course of that conflict. Now, what they did was they very quickly sought a negotiated ceasefire, and basically what they had used with the armed conflict was to create an area which still exists to this day, where they could then have autonomous communities. When the military attacked them again at the start of 1995, their immediate goal was actually to bring a cessation to violence. They were being very tactical about it, in other words, that they recognised that they needed an armed insurrection to create the autonomous area, but that it wasn't going to expand on that sort of basis, and that they didn't want to be constantly fighting a war with the military, a war in which there would be lots of casualties and lots of civilian casualties, so they mobilised Mexican civil society and looked for peace. But I could definitely support that as a strategy. It makes sense to me. It worked. They still exist. The Zapatistas were inspirational for a lot of people. I was there in 2 times, 96 and 97. 96 was part of this international gathering they had. It was called the Intergalactic Gathering of Humanity and Against Neoliberalism. It was way down into the jungle. The closing sessions, it was like a 10-hour bus trip getting down there. There were military checkpoints. The army flew paratrooper planes over it. It was quite a militarized situation. But a lot of us coming back from that were quite inspired and were going, well, they have this slogan of, be a Zapatista wherever you are. What does that actually mean? And so one of the things that came out of this was what was going to be later called the Summit Protest Movement. So I'm recording this on June the 18th, which is the 20th anniversary of the first part of that movement, which was an international day of action timed to coincide with the summit in Cologne. And the focus really was on London that day, because the people who organised in London had the idea of closing down the City of London. So that involved about 10,000 people going into the City of London and trying to storm various financial buildings, and then there being skirmishes between them and the police and between bankers throughout that whole day. And that really inspired a lot of people. They looked at it and went, wow, that sort of action is quite different from the sort of protests we're used to. So when the WTO had its summit in Seattle in September of that year, people who had been down with the Zapatistas, people who had seen what had happened in J18 in London, they were going, well, maybe we can do something like that here. And of course, then you have the Seattle protest, which became very famous, partially because of the vast amounts of tear gas the Seattle police used against protesters, and partly because a group of people smashed the windows in Starbucks and I think a Nike shop. That is an interesting question, because what happens then is the movement has this debate about, well, is breaking windows violent or is it non-violent, and how much does that matter? And that's precisely the sort of debate that I think the misuse of the Why Civil Resistance Works paper is being used by Extinction Rebellion, because it's trying to suggest that the violent action is the window breaking. There weren't 1,000 people killed, so under the definition of that paper, that wasn't a violent action. So I was involved in organising summit protests in Europe in September 2000. I was in Prague, which was the next meeting of the World Bank / IMF. That was quite a symbolic meeting, because the place we were meeting was the old headquarters of the Czech Communist Party, and the people who turned up to protest were mostly from Eastern Europe. Lots of Poles, lots of Czechs, people from the regional countries. These were all mostly people who'd been teenagers at the time of the transition in 1989. They'd seen the new regimes coming in. They'd realised they still didn't have very much control, and this was their opportunity to protest at it. And that protest escalated very, very rapidly. People were very determined to try and shut down the Congress. So it turned into this pitch battle that went on for hours between rioters with bricks, poles, and the odd Molotov cocktail on one hand, and then riot police with shields and batons, with water cannons, and then in the later stage with armoured personnel carriers. This went on for quite a while. Then a small breakaway group managed to get to the conference centre itself. They threw a few rocks at it. A couple of the delegates' cars were ambushed. There was, chaos all over Prague itself. There was an enormous police baton charge in Wenceslas Square that night. There was meant to be an opera for the World Bank delegates, but that got shut down when a load of people marched on that. And at that point, most World Bank delegates panicked. They either flew out of Prague the next morning, or they just didn't turn up for the rest of the conference, and it had to end a day early. So that was an event that saw a fair amount of what people might well call violence. I mean, there was definitely a pitched battle going on with the police. But again, which doesn't fall under the definition of violence as used by the Why Civil Resistance Works papers. There weren't 1,000 people killed, nobody was killed. And that's true of the whole summer protest movement. I mean, there's one death of Carlo Giuliani 3 years later in Genoa, and he's murdered by the police, basically. But otherwise, you're talking about a movement that, under those sort of definitions, is much more non-violent than violence. But again, it feels like the definitions, or the misuse of the Why Civil Resistance Works paper by the Extinction Rebellion leadership is precisely designed to stop a discussion of tactics around this. Extinction Rebellion is run by experienced activists. It's not people who are somehow clueless about this. In fact, many of them probably were around for the summer protests. Many of them probably took part in them. I suspect they may have been more on the fluffy side than the spiky side. And those two terms come from Britain in the mid-1990s, running into the 2000s, running through the summit protest period. And that's out of quite a strong environmental movement at that point. It's a movement that's trying to resist the building of new roads, new motorways. One common method of resistance was to build a camp on the route of the motorway, do tree sits, dig tunnels, force people to evict them, but also individual days of action where you just disrupt road travel. And there was a big debate within that movement between, which started with people distributing a leaflet arguing that it was important to keep things fluffy, by which they meant sort of extreme version of non-violence where you just sit in the road and you get battened. And in fact, it looks quite like what the Extinction Rebellion idea of non-violence is. I kind of wonder even if there's a connection in terms of people between that. Other people didn't agree with this, and they distributed a counter leaflet saying that there needed to be spiky confrontational tactics as well. And then there was a debate around that kind of ran through that road building thing, and that then informed the summit protest movement. And what came out of that debate really was most people concluding that what you needed was respect for what was called diversity of tactics, right? And that was the idea that if you've a protest that there's 10,000 people or 20,000 or 50,000 turning up to, they're not all going to have the same idea about what should be done. Some people will want to sit on the road, maybe get knocked around by the cops and arrested, and make a statement in that way. And then other people may well go, no, the important thing here is to shut down the summit we've come to. So to do that, we need to get through the police lines. And to do that, we need to be willing to defend ourselves. We might need to be willing to throw rocks at the cops. Those sort of ideas. Big debate, very often very heated. But what it sort of came down to in the end, although not everybody settled on this, was that probably the smart thing to do was to have different zones. Summit protests would typically take place in a city. There'd be a conference centre. The police would build barriers all around the conference centre, which would be the exclusion zone. But that actually meant that there was quite a large geographic area on the edge of police barriers. So you could say, well, this segment over here, this is for the people who want to do the non-violent direct action, sit on the road, maybe block access to the centre. They can be there. And over here we can have people who want to be more confrontational, try and push their way through the police lines, quite often in the form of a black bloc. And if we separate these two things out in terms of space, well then they're not really going to contaminate each other. Because obviously things get very messy if some people are sitting in the road and then other people are throwing rocks and trying to break through the police lines. That doesn't work very well. Terrible idea. So that was the kind of compromise that was made, and that mostly worked. I mean, of course, there's always difficulties, but it mostly worked. And my sense of the misuse of the why civil resistance works research is that Extinction Rebellion is trying to prevent that sort of compromise emerging. There's an Irish context to this, and in Ireland, if you were talking about a radical environmental movement and you were saying, well, how might that work? How might the police respond? The answers to those questions are actually quite easy, because we had a very significant movement running here from about 2007 to about 2012. And that's because Shell were trying to build this refinery in the west of Ireland at a place called Rossport. And there was initially significant local opposition to that, which was initially based on trying to use courts or local politicians to stop the project. And then as the community realised that wasn't going to work, was increasingly open to using direct action to disrupt the construction of the refinery. So from 2007, maybe late 2006, up to 2011, 2012, you saw huge amounts of militant action to try and stop the refinery being constructed. Earlier, most of this, it very much falls under what you would call non-violent direct action. People sitting on a road, block lorries moving, getting battened as they sat on the road. And it built up a bit as the years passed, people trying to block construction equipment. And then at one stage in 2009, where they built one of the compounds, there was the attempt to pull down the fences around the compounds using a winch. But in terms of, it definitely in terms of the why civil resistance works papers, very definitely non-violent, definitely not 1,000 people killed, again, nobody killed. But the media launched this sustained slander, basically directed at the campaign, which tries to present it as this crazy, violent thing that's happening. Why is that? Media working with the government, also working with capitalism in Ireland. So the point here is, if you were trying to organise effective resistance in Ireland, you were wondering how that might work, you were wondering how the cops might react, well, you'd certainly want to talk to the people involved in that Rossport struggle. They have massive experience over years of that. But the Irish franchise of Extinction Rebellion doesn't seem terribly interested in that. It seems more interested in reproducing what it thinks are the lessons from the movement in Britain, but the movement in Britain, I don't think is doing that great a job. It's got 1,100 people arrested. It's got lots of publicity out of that, but there are going to be consequences for those 1,100 people. In Ireland, the process of arrest and prosecution is used as a punishment against activists. It doesn't matter whether or not you get convicted. You're typically forced to appear in court maybe 9 times on different dates. In the case of the Rossport struggle, those court dates tended to be in the west of Ireland in Mayo. So if you were a Dublin activist, that meant 9 times you had to travel across the country to a court appearance and then travel back. And the court appearance very often would be like 5 minutes where a new date was set for the case. So that obviously has a big impact. If you're working, you need to take 9 days off. You have to explain why you're taking 9 days off. It's a punishment in itself. I'm not that familiar with the British system. I think the legal system is quite similar to ours, and I'm sure, therefore, you see a similar sort of punishment where even if nobody gets convicted, although in fact there were a couple of people at least in prison out of the last round of protests, it's still the case that people are pushed through this process of punishment. That does have an effect. It does demoralise people. Initially, it can be exhilarating, but it wears people down, and that's why the state does it. They know it works. Something worth looking at is Peter Gandaluz's additional critiques of the Why Civil Resistance Works papers. He's got some additional points around it, and I'll give a URL to that. So on that, what I want to do now is talk about the Irish experience of non-violent resistance and how it can lead into really bloody armed conflict. And this is relevant to the Why Civil Resistance Works papers, but also to this whole discussion about Extinction Rebellion. There's a certain element of the state doesn't really bother repressing movements unless it's actually threatened by them. And in a while I'm going to talk about some of that in the British context. But in terms of the United Kingdom, the really obvious and clear example of this is what happened in Northern Ireland in the late 60s and where that actually led to. So there's also a point here that there's a problem with the Why Civil Resistance Works paper in that you can't really separate movements from their history. To understand why particular choices are made, you need to look at the choices that were made before that, how movements were repressed before that, what actually makes sense. These are not, they're not abstractions created in the moment, but history shapes what people do. In the Irish context, we could go back 850 years to the Norman landings in Waterford, but I'm not going to do that, you'll be relieved. What I'm going to do is start instead in January 1967 with the formation of what is the most effective non-violent direct action movement in the United Kingdom. Not a term I like using, but it can be applied here in terms of legislation. The most effective movement in the United Kingdom of the last few decades, and that's the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, formed in 1967. Very definitely a non-violent movement. In fact, its first 18 months didn't really consist of doing any more than writing letters to the papers and saying things need to change. Its first march was only held in August 1968, so that's about 18 months after its initial formation, but it was dealing with an extremely repressive state, a state that, I won't get into the reasons and discussion of it, that's for history, but a state that was basically a Protestant state for a Protestant people, and that was very resistant to the idea that Catholics should have equal rights. That's the demand of the civil rights movement. It's boiled down essentially. It wanted equal rights for Catholics in the context of the Northern Ireland state, what would seem like a very modest and reasonable reform. However, when it had that march in 68, it found its way barred by the police. They weren't allowed march, and so that resulted in a sit-down that went on for a few hours. So very kind of mild, non-violent direct action, but the start of something. The same period, a thing called the Derry Housing Action Committee is becoming active. It's much more directed towards non-violent direct action, so they pretty much straight away started doing blocking roads for 24 and 48-hour periods. Again, if you're watching what Extinction Rebellion has been doing in London, that's quite a familiar thing to you. That wasn't that much. I mean, in terms of non-violent direct action, seems pretty mild, but given the context of the Northern Ireland state, this was to see the results of state repression being unleashed, and this was going to escalate quite quickly. So October the 5th, 1968, the state banned a planned march in Derry. That march went ahead anyway, and police attacked it and kept attacking it. The footage from this march is quite famous. It was on television at the time. You saw a line of members of parliament who were kind of up front, went up towards the police first, and then got battened and chased off the street. And then more people started to go through, and they were battened as well and driven back into the Catholic area of Derry. There's also some concessions in this period. The governments are trying to kind of buy off this movement that's starting to emerge. On October the 5th, 1968, some people did defend themselves against police attacks. There was some fighting back. That's pretty much inevitable. It's particularly inevitable in a context where you know the state is extremely hostile to you. But in terms of the Why Civil Resistance Works paper, we are nowhere near meeting the test for violent movements. There are no deaths at this point in time. In fact, if you look at the history of the conflict in Northern Ireland, it doesn't reach the point where 1,000 combatants are killed until maybe sometime in 1973, 74 or 75. In other words, 6 years after the non-violent movement had started. And what I want to do is talk about how it reached that point. So that's a long story. And it's a story where cycles of non-violent protest are met with increasing state repression. Some people defend themselves as part of that. More state repression gets wheeled out the next time, and that escalates. So that built up throughout the rest of 1968 and 1969, and then really exploded into violence on October the 12th, 1969 in Derry, where again, in response to police attacks, there's massive rioting in the area called the Bogside. And basically that rioting manages to drive the police out of the Bogside over the course of 3 days. Basically, there's so much fighting that the police are exhausted, the police reserves are exhausted, barricades go up in Derry, and the police are essentially excluded from that area. And that exclusion actually is going to last a couple of years. It's going to be called Free Derry. A similar thing actually happens in Belfast at the same time, and it's called Free Belfast. Obvious parallel there. And the police forces are so exhausted by this that the British government decide to deploy troops. So you've had this sudden escalation from, what is a United Kingdom police force? That sometimes people in London might like to ignore that and like to pretend there's a particular history to British policing. And I'm going to show in a minute that history, even in England itself, has actually been quite violent. But they like to think that, no, it's all about, the bobby on the beat. And if you're nice to the bobby on the beat, then they'll be nice to you. Now, if you look at the Why Civil Resistance Works papers, it's got a really brief mention of Northern Ireland, and it's clear from that really brief mention that it puts it in the violent movement categories. Now, that's fair enough if you're in the perspective of 1994, towards the end of that conflict. You're looking back in it, there's about 3,500 people have died in it, over 1,000 of those are combatants. But if you're in 1969, nobody has died at this point. There's going to be a few deaths this year because it's about to escalate. And instead, you've had this very clearly non-violent movement. And now you're in a point where this is going to transition from one form to the other. So how do you do this test in terms of success? What does it mean to, describe what was a non-violent movement as violent, because that's what it's pushed into, and then to decide either it fails or succeeds based on that. The key date in all this is January 1972. What happens in January 1972 is there's another civil rights march. Again, it's been banned. It's not allowed into the centre of Derry. The march goes ahead anyway. It's huge. And as it gets to where the barriers are, there's a conflict with the troops on the barriers. And the next thing is shooting starts. Right? And what we now know is that the parachute regiment had made the decision that they were going to kill people that day. The troops had been told this was the case. They opened fire on people. The excuse that was used afterwards, but it was a bullshit excuse, was that they thought the people they were shooting were nail bombers. Right? This is utterly discredited at this point in time. There's no particular need to go into it, but if you're interested in that, you can Google it. So what you actually have is you've an elite unit of the British Army being used to murder civilians, right? And they murdered 13 people on that day. And that, of course, transforms what's happening. So you hit a point where if that happens, if you're on that march and you're shot at and the person beside you is killed, or even if you're sitting at home and the guy down the street is killed, right? Then that suddenly changes what you see as good tactics and bad tactics. And what it did was it made a lot of people very angry, and they wanted to be able to fight back. And when you're being shot at, fighting back means you shoot back. And that's what happened. So after Bloody Sunday, things explode in the north. It becomes this period of very intense conflict. A huge number of people are killed in the next 2 or 3 years. Part of the reason for that is that the people who were taking up arms felt that they could win this, and they could win this quickly, and they used quite a lot of violence at that point. There's bombs going off all over the north. There's a lot of people being killed in these bombs. There's ambushes on troops. There's troops murdering civilians. There's troops and Republican groups having shootouts in which troops are killed and Republicans are killed. You've, 2 or 3 years where there's a lot of people killed before it starts to quieten down a bit, and then you just have this constant rate of death, with the occasional spike, for instance, in 1981, running up to the end of the conflict. And the point I'm making with this story, there's 2 points. One is the people in 1967 and 1968 and 1969 didn't choose violence. They were choosing to have a non-violent movement. Some of them chose to defend that movement against police repression, but overall it's definitely a non-violent movement. It's primarily a non-violent movement in the language of the white civil resistance works papers, and because there's no deaths until 69, there's no question of it being a violent movement in those terms. But although people had made that choice and held to that choice for a number of years, and really I think you can argue that they mostly held to it up until Bloody Sunday, circumstances ran beyond their control. And it wasn't so much that they then made a choice to be a violent movement, but that was imposed on them by state repression. And that's the key story, I think, that needs to be taken out of that. You don't always have a choice in this. You do have a choice on how to react to it, but you don't necessarily have a choice about what's going to happen. So that story of the 5 years of non-violent resistance in the north of Ireland that led to Bloody Sunday and to it becoming what was clearly a violent struggle after that date is a simplification. There's much more detail of that. I'll throw in some links, you can go and read more about that. But essentially it shows that this definition of violence is seldom clear cut. You can't use it on its own. You've got to also ask, well, why? Why did something become violent? Why did that seem like a wise option? Was it the case that people had a completely free choice in this? And I think it's important to ask that question, because actually if you want to avoid being forced down the route of violence where you don't think it's the right way to go, you have to have a discussion about how that's happened in the past. You have to have an understanding about it. You can't just treat it as an empty moral question, that people made the wrong choice. And that choice was made free of other contexts. The other aspect why it's important in terms of talking about Extinction Rebellion and their attitudes to the police is that it shows an extreme naivety when you're talking about what UK policing has been when you don't talk about what happened in Northern Ireland. Some of the same people are still active. Some of them only retired recently. The skills they picked up in repressing protests in the north were skills that were brought back to England. But we can see that not just in connection to Ireland, we can also see that in connection to England. So these colonial methods of policing, as typical with colonial powers, you save your extreme forms of repression for the colonies and you try and keep things on a more consensus basis back home. You don't bring home the same methods. When Belgium was brutally colonizing Congo in the 1900s, it wasn't performing the same sort of atrocious crimes, things like amputating people's hands for not working hard enough on the population in Belgium as it did in the population in the colonies. But you do bring some of those methods back, and you often use them against the people that are most marginalized or most threaten the state in your domestic situation. And so in England, you see the kind of more extreme right police methodology developed in the north being used against Black and Asian populations in Brixton, in Toxteth, and in Bradford. And then in 1984, you see it deployed on a massive scale against a section of the British working class, and that's the British miners, in what became called afterwards the Great British Miners' Strike. Lasted almost a year, from 1984 to 1985. That was brutally suppressed, extreme violence from the police, and people are still angry about it to this day. I mean, I talked about Bloody Sunday earlier, and at the moment there's this demand for the prosecution of one of the soldiers involved in Bloody Sunday, Soldier F. But actually there's also demands from the mining communities that were suppressed in 1984 that there should be inquiries into the level of violence used against them, and particularly the level of violence used in what was called the Battle of Orgreave, which was a massive police assault on picketing miners who were trying to picket the Orgreave coke plant. The key takeaway from everything I'm saying here is what determines the level of state violence is not the number on aggregate. So when you put it all together, is not the number of friendly chats you've had with the local bobby while he's arresting you. That might impact things a little bit locally until the heat gets turned up, but what the state decides to do. The police forces are required to follow orders. It's very, very rare that they refuse to follow orders. One of the few examples being 1907 in Belfast, very long time ago, but still talked about today because it's so unusual. That's the way policing works. So what I want to do now, and I'm coming towards the end here, is dig a little further into this Why Civil Resistance Works paper, because it's kind of curious. I mean, that kind of, dividing line of 1,000 people being killed before something's considered violence isn't intuitively obvious to people. You'd sort of think, that seems very high, that's a lot of people, why wouldn't it be lower? Maybe it should be one person, or maybe you might allow for an accidental killing and it could be 3 people or something, But 1,000 seems very high. And you sort of wonder as to why that is. And in fact, there's a backstory to the paper, and there's an article in the Yale Journal of Law that gets into the backstory in a couple of ways. Well, one is, where did the paper come from? And the paper came from the two authors spending a night at a conference debating whether non-violent campaigns to oust regimes or fight for self-determination. So the campaigns they're talking about are to oust regimes or fight for self-determination. So you're talking about regime change movements here. Have historically proven more successful than violent ones. So they decided to research that question to find out what the answer is. So here there should be a big klaxon going off, because regime change movements, right? So movements that aim at either self-determination, so either they aim at having a part of an area declaring independence and becoming a new independent country, or regime change, so they aim at overthrowing the government. That's a very long way from climate change activism. It doesn't have those sort of ambitions. So immediately you sort of go, well, how the hell do you apply those numbers to the numbers in relation to climate change movements in England at the moment? And can't really see how that's done. So then I got kind of curious about it, because it's kind of like, well, who are the people having this conversation? Why are they talking about this? So Maria J. Stephen, I found her biography page, and you start to understand this argument about why they're arguing about how the US can best bring about regime change. Is it best to use violence or non-violence movements? It's an interesting framing of the question. So she's done quite a lot of things. For instance, she's worked with the European NATO Policy Office of the US Department of Defense, and she's worked at the NATO HQ in Brussels. She was also the lead foreign affairs officer in the US State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, where she worked on both policy and operations for the Afghanistan and the Syria engagements. Interesting. I mean, that's quite an interesting. NATO, Afghanistan, Syria, that's quite a range of deployments. You can kind of see why somebody with that sort of background would want to know what's the most effective way of overthrowing governments that the US wants to overthrow. Is it, non-violent mass campaigns, or is it insurrections? And, like a lot more than 1,000 people got killed in the Syrian civil war, for instance. So maybe that's quite a good measurement. But it's not really the question we want to answer. What we're trying to talk about building a movement to halt climate change, it's a different sort of question and needs very different sort of options. What exactly is the relevancy of this paper? And then you start to pay more attention to the case studies it looks at. And I mean, East Timor, it looks at the struggle for self-determination in East Timor over several pages. It's really quite detailed. So there's this section that's interesting because it says, whereas violent insurgency campaigns within East Timor fielded a maximum of 1,500 fighters, the non-violent campaign produced cross-cutting alliances with tens of thousands of participants. That's a weird comparison to me. I mean, that's comparing apples and oranges. You know, if you're going to essentially become a guerrilla fighter, probably go into the mountains, live in the mountains, be a full-time guerrilla fighter, that's a level of commitment. That's somewhat different than taking part in civil organisations and maybe turning out for demonstrations, even under quite repressive conditions. And the other thing that immediately strikes me, you know, knowledge of what's happened in Ireland, but also other things, is that separation is very seldom all that strict. There's normally people who have kind of their foot in both camps, sometimes at the same time, or sometimes they're involved in one and they move into the other based off their experiences of that involvement. You can't necessarily separate them out and then go, oh, well, that's the side that actually worked and then this other side didn't work. And you can't necessarily do that based on, well, there's more people doing A than B. It doesn't really make sense. But we're so far now from the way Extinction Rebellion are using this paper. It doesn't make sense. And as I said at the start, very typical of the sort of methods climate change deniers pull. You know, you cite some relatively obscure paper that probably nobody's actually read. You give some numbers from the paper, and people get a bit overwhelmed by the numbers, but you know, very few people are going to go and check up on those. I only did so because I read the Peter Gentilow's bit. And you just don't point out that there are obvious caveats about applying the research to the area you're trying to do it to. You know, if we go right back to the statements I read out from the FAQ, there are hints in there as to why this might be a bit weird, and I guess that's a certain level of honesty. But there's no real suggestion that, hey, here are some numbers, but really, you know, these numbers probably don't apply to the situation we're talking about, which should have happened. And in fact, this demonstrates a major problem overall with the EXO model, which is it's very much based on mobilizing newcomers. So, you know, getting new people out on the streets, getting them involved in action really fast, on the basis that there's an urgent crisis, which is true, that needs a response to, and telling them that the important tactical questions have already been settled. We've experts, they've looked at this. Look, science, look at the numbers here. 56%, 23%. You don't need to worry about that. You just need to get yourself arrested because we know that's how change will come about. The urgency of action required to halt climate change is real, but so too is the need for democratic decision-making processes and spaces where tactics can be debated out. The people getting involved, particularly those who are putting themselves up for arrest, need to have also being exposed to some good discussions about tactics around this. Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? What's it based on? And not just told, well, here's a pamphlet we've written that's got all the answers in it, and look at these numbers, aren't they great? That's science. So I'm going to conclude with restating my own position. That's probably important. And that's essentially that tactically, I think non-violence makes sense in most contexts. Certainly in the context we find ourselves at the moment, mass mobilisations, getting lots of people active, that's the way to go. However, I think it's important to have these tactical discussions, to look at what the history of struggles are, to learn from the struggles that have gone immediately before us. In the Irish context, that means learning from Rossport. In the English context, that means looking at the road protests. Internationally, it means looking at the summit protests and look at the way people have dealt with how do you deal with state repression? How do you deal with non-violence being made ineffective because the summit you're trying to shut down is behind a ring of steel, right? And the decision that was obviously made was, well, you break through the ring of steel. That seems a fairly legitimate decision you might reach again in the future, but you need to have these discussions now. That means a movement that has spaces for such discussion, that has real democracy, you know, so it's not decisions that have been made by the leaders and your job is to implement those decisions, but together we're going to discuss these things and we're going to reach decisions and then moving forward on that sort of basis. 11 years. It used to be 12 years. That was a year ago, though. And we needed that first year was needed. Yep, we have 11 years to try and halt this process of runaway climate change. And if you look at the statistics over the last year, it's got worse. It's got a lot worse, actually. Oil extraction, gas extraction, coal extraction, they've all gone up. They're not going down, they're not stabilising, they're still going up. There's no real commitment from anywhere yet to change that. Some governments have passed climate emergency bills. The Irish government passed one. Completely meaningless. You know, they're not tied to any sort of effective action, and in fact the Irish government are busily blocking that action. So the urgency of moving forward, the urgency to act, but the urgency to act with wisdom, and that's not wisdom that comes down from above from some group of founders, but the wisdom we develop collectively, that's the really key thing. So that's what I want to conclude with. Our understanding of non-violence, what the limits of that is, that has to be a collective process that comes out through us discussing this, through deciding what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and through learning from history and from those around us and people who've engaged in such stuff in the past. Hopefully you found this discussion useful. If you did, then you might like it, you might share it, you might subscribe to the channel. I'm hoping to get a video out every 2 weeks to every month or so, and getting deeper into some of these topics as we've gone. But thanks for listening to this one today.